Hello and good afternoon or morning as the case may be. Welcome to Petabytes of Profit, Unlocking the Insights of Video Data. Here's a brief description of what we'll cover today. Many organizations have historically relied on video surveillance for safety, security, and other, quote, defensive, unquote, purposes. However, with improvements in cameras and in analytics capabilities, some organizations are starting to leverage large amounts of video data to transform their business process and deliver better customer experiences, improve business operations, and gain competitive advantage in the market. In this session, we'll provide insight into how video data is being leveraged for use cases beyond security. We'll explore various technology choices and deployment patterns for video management, and we'll discuss practical considerations and insights in choosing and deploying a VMS. First, a little housekeeping. The audio portion of this webcast is broadcast over the internet. Make sure your computer or device audio is available unmuted and the volume is turned up to an acceptable level. If you're having trouble with receiving the audio, please select the question mark in the upper corner of the Global Meet interface and select Test My System Now. This will give you information on your connection and how to remedy any problems you may have. Often just simply disconnecting and rejoining the event will allow you to catch a better stream of the audio if you're experiencing any problems. You can ask questions. It's easy to submit your questions for our presenters. On the left side of your screen, there's a box labeled Ask a Question, where you can enter those questions. Questions related to the webcast topic will be held and answered during the Q&A session at the end of the event. Questions related to technical issues can also be entered in this box and will be answered immediately by our webcast producers. So I am Scott Goldfein, Editor-in-Chief and Associate Publisher of Security Sales and Integration. And our speaker today is Sanjay Chawla, Chief Product Officer for Salient Systems. Sanjay is Salient's Chief Product Officer and brings years of experience in product marketing and product management in both hardware and software technology products. He obsesses over customers in the VMS market in order to keep Salient's products useful, relevant, and enjoyable. Prior to Salient, Sanjay was the Director of Product at DataCal, and prior to that, he was the Director of Product at Hypori. Sanjay holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Georgia Tech. And so at this time, I turn it over to you, Sanjay. Take it away.
Perfect. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Excited to share with you these materials we've pulled together on unlocking insights in video data. I think it's really become a focus for a lot of organizations, and we're here to share some of our insights. Now, before we get too far, I want to do a little bit of an introduction so you have a better sense of who I am, and more importantly, a sense of who Salient is. It gives us the credibility to speak to this content on unlocking insights in video data. So we'll start there. We'll then go into some examples, and these are actually pulled from some of Salient's customers that have been able to leverage the video data that they have. And so we'll share a few of those examples. Then we'll get into actual deployment patterns and recommendations, and then wrap up. So with that, a little introduction, and we'll start with myself. We'll keep this fun. So I started out very curious and very technology-minded. My young days were dominated by Legos, erector sets, and train sets. And perhaps it's not surprising that from there I got into things like rockets and flamethrowers, got an engineering degree from Georgia Tech, and found my way into technology as I joined the workforce. And my career actually has been predominantly in B2B, business-to-business systems, especially enterprise software. And so in many ways, I'm a little bit of an outsider to the surveillance and security markets. I joined Salient, actually it'll be 2 years soon, closer to 2 years than a year and a half, I believe. And so I've got a good mix of perspective of the video surveillance markets, but also have a lot of thoughts from my time in enterprise software. And of course, another huge part of my journey is Salient itself. And so it's worth talking a little bit about Salient. Salient is a leading provider of video surveillance solutions. And what's really exciting is these solutions go beyond security, and they help drive business operations with actionable intelligence from our software platform. Now, a lot of people might not know, but Salient's got over 1 million cameras out in the world that it helps support. The largest deployment is over 30,000 cameras. We've got thousands of end users. We've got a global footprint, hundreds of partners, and we've been growing quite a bit. And so this is a little bit of Salient's success in the marketplace. And so with, again, my perspective in enterprise software and Salient's long history in the video surveillance space, we're excited to share some insights about how some of our customers are getting more from their video surveillance system and how they're putting their video data to use. Because this will lay the groundwork for some of the deployment patterns and recommendations that we'll have to share. So the first one has to do with a transportation and logistics company. They focus predominantly on LTL, less than load freight. And they had made a decision to deploy a video surveillance system, and they used Salient as a part of this, which is why we got intimately familiar with how they were making use of their video data. But they deployed this in these warehouses where these LTL freight would get loaded up. And there were some very traditional benefits, really preventing theft and loss, validating safety protocols, and reducing OSHA violations, ensuring that goods were being handled properly. And that's very vanilla, bread and butter, video surveillance and physical security use cases. But they discovered that there's some other really exciting things that they could do with this video that they had. Previously, before a truck left a bay, it would be a fairly manual process, often involving someone riding a bicycle over to make sure that the truck was loaded appropriately and ready to leave. Well, that meant that some trucks didn't really get fully inspected. Sometimes things that needed to be on a truck didn't actually get on the truck. And there were quite a few inefficiencies. With the video surveillance system, they were able to actually increase inspection coverage to nearly 100% because it could be done remotely from an operating room. And this was able to help them really drive their raw load average and drive a much more efficient freight operation, because before dispatching the truck to leave, someone could visually confirm that it was loaded up properly. But that's not where they ended. They went a step further, and this company actually integrated shipment weight with video data. So looking at a given object that was going to get loaded into a truck and getting the weight of it and comparing it really to the volume. And in fact, there's another thing they integrated that with, which is their ERP system. And they were able to identify that some goods were being misclassified. A great example of it is a box that says sporting equipments, which has a much lower freight class, much lower insurance, and really is a much cheaper good to ship than, say, guns and ammo. And they would get things misclassified, and they would discover this by realizing that the density of the object, the weight of the object given its volume, just didn't match up. And so, for example, something marked sporting goods that they were going to ship, if they detected these anomalies, they would open up the box and sometimes discover that it was guns and ammo. What they did is they went back and charged back customers for misclassified goods. And in the first year alone, they made $40 million to their bottom line. What's really interesting about this use case is it's a great way to leverage video data. It has nothing really to do with physical security, and it's just an asset that they already had, all of this footage of the goods being loaded into trucks. We've got another example. This is from a large home goods retailer. And again, retail has long used video surveillance for very traditional use cases, reduce and prevent shrinkage, again, OSHA violations and safety protocols, and also really to help manage liability and litigation. evidence, for example, to overturn fraudulent claims like a slip and fall incident in a store. But this particular retailer was also able to leverage all this video data and take it a step further. So outside of the loss prevention and asset protection groups, they were able to actually equip operations and inventory groups with this video data and perform remote inspections. This is actually particularly helpful recently during the pandemic, where due to lockdowns and other issues, some of this travel wasn't even possible. Well, what they discovered is they're saving nearly $500,000 of travel expenses per week. That added up very quickly. In fact, we didn't put it on here, but this particular customer was able to reward all employees with a $2 raise during the middle of a pandemic by leveraging video data in this way. And so that was one awesome way to use and leverage the video they had. They were also able to remotely track inventory and, more importantly, integrate with a facial image database to quickly identify anyone they needed to be on the lookout for, so BOLO lists, and that way they were able to prevent additional loss and shrinkage. But on the flip side, they were also able to keep track of VIP guests, people who spent a lot and would come by the stores frequently, where they could provide a white glove experience and treatment. And so these were some additional ways in which they enhanced the overall customer and user experience by leveraging video data. Last example I've got to share is in the banking space. And again, banking historically has also made use of video surveillance. A lot of it is actually because of state and federal regulations. But this particular customer was able to go a step further. They were able to actually track engagement with in-branch advertisements. So, if you've been to a branch office for your local bank, often it's they've got some signs up for new credit card signups and other offers and deals. And it's often challenging to understand if they're relevant, if people are even signing up for them, if people are paying attention to them. Well, by using video surveillance and the video data, they were able to actually extract these insights on who's looking at it, what the engagement was, and they were actually able to increase the conversion rate of signups for some of these new offers. They're also able to better manage the tellers that were on staff at any given point in time and able to assist customers by keeping tabs on the queue length. And so they were able to reduce wait time and really improve customer experience. And the last part is they were able to actually integrate with license plate recognition analytics in order to identify VIPs that would frequently visit and again, deliver a much better customer experience. Again, the pattern is, hey, there's some people who come by the bank branch office every single week to deposit money, and we can streamline the experience for them. So these are just some of the ways in which some customers that we know about in completely different industry verticals, we're all finding really creative ways to leverage the video data that they already had from their video surveillance system and drive actionable business operations, customer experience improvements, and other things that really gave them a competitive edge in the marketplace. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about how you might be able to help customers that you're working with do the same. As integrators, often, you're looked at as trusted advisors. And so my hope is by stepping through some deployment patterns and some of these recommendations, you're in a position to better guide some of your customers through the decisions that will hopefully help them get more out of the video that they're already collecting and storing today. So before we go too far, in the risk of sounding really basic, I think it's helpful to level set on the components of a video management system. So I've marked here in green all the pieces that make up a modern VMS. An NVR, or a network video recorder, that connects typically to IP cameras. There are ways to connect up analog cameras as well, but over the network, you've connected up to cameras, and these NVRs, these network video recorders, typically are responsible for recording the video that is coming off the cameras. And so they feed that into the storage. These NVRs are also responsible typically for delivering live video to any clients that request it, as well as any requests for previously recorded video. And so we've got the client as well, which is typically another piece of the VMS. And lastly, in order to orchestrate all this, to manage the users, the permissions, storage settings, and a variety of other things, there's typically a management component, a management server or service. Now, there's two types of traffic, and this does matter a lot, and we'll talk about this in a bit more, but there's management and configuration traffic, which is often pretty lightweight and not very bandwidth intensive. And then there's the actual video and metadata traffic that's coming off the camera or other sensors. And usually this is the heavy stuff. It takes quite a bit of bandwidth to move this around. There's quite a bit of storage required to hold on to all this video and metadata. And so this brings rise to a number of different deployment models. Of course, the sensor, typically the camera, is always going to be located on premise. It kind of has to be. But all of the other pieces that represent a modern VMS, the NVR, the storage, the management server, and the clients, can either be on premise, kind of on site somewhere, or remote, whether that's in the cloud or elsewhere. And the deployment patterns, depending on where some of these different components are actually deployed, whether it's on premise, in the cloud, or somewhere else remote, have a very significant impact on whether or not it's even possible to extract insights from video data, or how easy it is to extract meaningful business and operational insights from video data. Unsurprisingly, specific market segments and verticals have different preferences. And so as an integrator, as you're taking some of this knowledge, one of the things you might need to work either with or against is the predispositions of your market. If everyone in the vertical or market that you're serving has a certain preference or way of thinking about video surveillance and how to set up or deploy some of these systems, you might need to do some education in order for some of these customers to gain insights that they previously didn't have access to. And some of that might be due to the deployment model. Of course, as you start getting into more sophisticated deployments, so mid-market and enterprise type of deployments, it's very unusual to have a one-size-fits-all type of pattern. And it is extremely common to have a lot of flexibility in the deployment models, especially when you get to the enterprise side. Now, to make it easy, I've created a cheat sheet of some of the very common deployment patterns. Now that we've looked at the components and talked about how they can live in different places, here's some of the things we actually see in the marketplace. And these range from no footprint, meaning only the camera is on premise. Everything else is somewhere not on premise. So the storage is typically up in the cloud. The transcoding that needs to be done to serve up live viewing requests is happening in the cloud. Any type of analytic processing is happening either directly on the camera or in the cloud. And then kind of the management system orchestration is happening in the cloud. A great example of this type of deployment model is a solution, for example, like Verkada, where it's only the cameras that are on premise and everything else in the cloud. That has some pros and cons, and we'll talk through that in the recommendations. Next up is what I'll call a bridge appliance. So again, the sensor is always going to be on premise, but the storage is predominantly in the cloud, but there's an appliance that will help buffer and bridge some of the data between the on-site camera deployment and the cloud. But all the rest of it, the transcoding, the analytic processing, the management, is typically happening in the cloud, or in the case of analytics, either the combination of the camera and the cloud. Next up, you've got what I'll call a very traditional, old school video surveillance deployment where everything is on premise. The storage, any transcoding that's going on, analytic processing, management, all on-prem. You've then got another model that I'd say was really popularized by OpenEye. I think they were kind of the first to really come to market with this idea, this notion of cloud managed, where, again, the sensor is always on premise, but effectively all the parts and pieces except for the management are on-prem. And it's really the management component that's happening up in the cloud. And lastly, what a lot of especially large enterprises need, and there's a way to mix and match a lot of these things, is what we'll call hybrid. And hybrid means that these different components, the storage, any transcoding and analytic processing, any management, parts of it are done on premise, parts of it are done in the cloud. And this can create extremely robust systems that are flexible and able to meet a lot of different use cases and needs. So there's a complexity in pulling off these hybrid systems, but typically they're much more suited to enterprises. Now, these are some very common patterns. There are pros and cons to each of these approaches in actually extracting useful insights. And before we get into some of those key decisions and recommendations, the one other layer to bring into this is that when we look at modern VMS deployments, it isn't just a video-based sensor like a camera that's feeding data in. As we saw in some of the examples we shared, whether it's with the logistics company, the retailer, or even the bank, often there are a number of other sensors or other data systems, whether it's license plate recognition processing, access control, facial recognition, inventory, point of sale data. There are a lot of other things that typically people want to associate with the video in order to gain some of these insights. And so modern VMS deployments are just getting more and more complex. And it's in part because the video is one of the heaviest data assets. It's the hardest thing to move around. It's the hardest thing to process. And it becomes much easier for people to bring in more lightweight data like transaction information, access control information, and feed that into something like a VMS in order to operationalize and gain some of these insights. So again, don't be surprised when modern deployments look a whole lot more complicated than some of the slides that we've shared here. And it's because of some of these other factors. So that leads us to some really key decisions and recommendations. Now, to frame it up, if there's one thing to walk away from, it's really a couple of very important questions that you make sure you engage your clients on. As a customer starts thinking about doing more with the video data that they have, I really think about it as, okay, you want to extract insights from video data. How are we going to go about that? The first question that really needs to be answered is, well, what data do we have access to? What data are we collecting? Do you have a platform that can ingest not just video data, but some of these additional pieces of information that you're going to have to associate with video or with some of the metadata associated with video? If you can't do that, you're going to be in a really tough spot trying to extract meaningful operational and business insights. The next is, video data especially is very heavy. Where are you going to store it? How are you going to access it? And how are you going to process this? Does the data actually belong to you? Is it normalized? Meaning, if there's an analytic that you're running, but every single time you run the analytic or all the different places you run the analytic, you get a slightly different data structure. It can be a lot of work to put that together. Is the data securely accessible? Is it easy to integrate with? And what type of compute and bandwidth ramifications exist in trying to either access or process some of this data? So these are some questions that really you're going to want to map out ahead of time if you can. But at a minimum, you're going to have to engage your clients on these things in order to help them realize all of that locked potential that's trapped in the video data that they can use to improve customer experience and business operations and other things. And then the last part, and this part's probably overlooked, but really, really important. And it's actually, once you've associated video data with other things, once you've extracted and processed all of this metadata, the question becomes, how do users in the system actually get to visualize it, search it, sort it, and do something as a result of all of this data processing that's happened? And so that's also super important. And we'll talk about, again, some recommendations there. So with that, we don't necessarily have the time to talk about all of the different kind of considerations that go into data collection, data processing, data visualization. But we're going to focus on a few key highlights, stuff that probably comes up more often, and some stuff that, as an integrator, you're often a key influencer in helping your clients sort through the right decisions. So the first is just, what platform do you choose? Do you choose what I'll call an open platform or a closed platform? And before getting too hung up on the strict definitions of open or closed, it's really thinking about the capabilities that it provides. A open platform will typically allow you to select the best of breed components. Certainly that's being able to pick the types and makes and models and manufacturers of cameras that you want. But often it's other components, being able to pick and choose the proper access control solution, being able to pick and choose the right video analytics libraries or engines. Because the whole idea is with open platforms, you can very quickly take advantage of any innovations. You can tailor the solution to the very specific needs of a given customer or use case or vertical. It becomes very easy to replace individual components. And really, it can be a lot more price competitive because there's competition for each of these things. If there's 2 or 3 different contenders for facial recognition analytic, you can drive that price down, as opposed to a closed platform where there's only one facial recognition solution. It's the one provided by the platform. Now, the downside to an open platform is there is some real work to make sure that everything is integrated properly, that everything interoperates, often working with multiple vendors and kind of handling some of the support through more than one channel. So that can be a challenge. Closed platforms, on the other hand, much easier and quicker to deploy. The support's a little bit easier since it's through one vendor, but I think, again, not to pick on them, but an example of this is something like Verkada, where you're locked into what that platform provides. You can't easily bring your own analytics solution. It's hard to leverage additional innovation that's going on in the industry. It's really difficult to customize or tailor to specific use cases because it's just what that platform provides and that's it. And it can kind of turn into a hostage situation where deployment and replacement can turn into an all or none type of scenario. And you don't really get to own the data. That data can be really opaque. So if you wanted to go off and bolt on your own analytics after the fact, that starts to get really challenging and complicated to do potentially. Our recommendation, go with a solution that's as open as possible. Again, there's no right or wrong answer to any of this because it's going to depend often on the customer, the use case, what type of insight they're trying to extract. Nonetheless, from what we've seen and all of the examples we've shared, customers that have more open platforms tend to be more successful in extracting meaningful insights from the video data that they have. Next up, we've got actual data collection. And while there are many facets to data collection, for example, we're not going to touch on transaction data or LPR data or inventory data. These are all other types of data you can pull into a VMS in order to reach some of these use cases. But let's focus on one of the most fundamental and important things, which is the video data itself and collecting data from cameras. I'd say there's kind of a healthy debate in the marketplace on whether to go with something like ONVIF, which is kind of an industry standard, or native camera drivers. And there are pros and cons on both sides of this. Now, the huge lift to ONVIF is that there's a lot of data normalization work that you don't need to worry about. And let's be clear about what data normalization is. A very simple example is something like object classification, determining if it's a vehicle or a person. Now, there are a number of different cameras that can do this. In fact, there are a number of different analytics vendors on the server side that can also do this. But if the labels that they're using are a little bit different, if the data structures that they're using to do this are a little bit different, even if you have a vehicle detection analytic deployed, it can be a huge challenge. You're basically trading one data problem for another data problem if you end up having to normalize all of this slightly different formatted data on vehicle detection. ONVIF tackles some of that, not all of it, but some of that. And it makes it much easier for people to extract and drive some of these operational benefits because they don't need to solve a data normalization problem. It's also easy to work across a broad set of devices. And ONVIF is typically not impacted by firmware updates. Of course, there are risks. The issue is that ONVIF doesn't behave as expected because the specs kind of put the responsibility on camera manufacturers and VMS manufacturers in order to kind of implement the spec and do self-conformance. And so there is a risk there. Support can be a little bit more complex as well, and it can be difficult to take advantage of all the capabilities of the camera because some of those features might not be supported over ONVIF. Native drivers, on the other hand, give you access to those more advanced camera features. The support is a bit more straightforward. Typically, the manufacturers have validated the performance, but the challenge is it can be difficult to scale. It can be difficult for a bunch of different VMSs to support this sometimes because there's more work to support the native driver. And firmware updates can disrupt the support. Our recommendation is, if you can, go with something like OnVIF. Now, this depends a lot. If you're working, of course, with maybe smaller size deployments, you're able to lock in a very specific camera manufacturer. There could be some good reasons to maybe go with a native camera driver. But what we see, especially for the types of customers that are trying to do more than just traditional safety, security, and surveillance use cases with video, is that they tend to be larger customers, enterprise or kind of mid-market and above. They tend to have a mix of different makes and models and manufacturers of cameras. And often they're in the discovery process as well of what type of insight they want to draw from the video data that they have. And so the data normalization challenges can be pretty significant if using native drivers. Scalability can be a challenge, even configuring this on every single device. If it's a native driver, can be a bit of a challenge. So that's why we recommend OnVIF. But there are definitely reasons to go a different route. Next, beyond how to actually pull in data from the camera, is thinking about where that data actually gets stored. And there are a couple of different options for where to store the data. So one is the device. And it's probably risky to store the actual video data on the device because it's typically not encrypted. It's typically either an SSD or an SD card, and so it has a limited capacity. It has a very limited duty cycle. If you keep constantly writing and rewriting onto that SSD or SD card, you can wear it out pretty quick. And it's not really secure. I mean, someone can quite literally get a ladder and rip the camera off the wall, and there goes your data. So, the one thing it does provide is a little bit of redundancy. If you're storing the data in other places as well, and there's some stored on the device, you can use the data on the device to fill in any gaps and have a slightly more robust system. So there is a little bit of upside. I have it kind of as a yellow. Next best is storing the video on a server on the site. And what's great is it's fairly reliable. Typically, there's not an internet. It's typically an intranet, so just a LAN connection. Also, that means you don't need to worry about bandwidth costs or fees because you can just wire that up to have the cameras and the NVR on a dedicated network. It's very easy and straightforward to tackle a lot of integrations, especially with things like access control or other systems that are at the site. But what can be challenging is remote access can be a little bit more difficult, and the footprint can start to get very complex because now you've got little bits of video data scattered at every single site. So what some people then think about is centralizing all of this somewhere on premise. And what's great is, you can drive down storage costs by centralizing the storage. The footprint is a lot simpler because all the video data is now in a centralized location. It's easier to set up remote access because you only have to do that once to your centralized data storage site. It's easier to make sure that you're in compliance. You have the right number of days of retention and whatnot. You don't need to look at the 30 different locations. You can just look at one place and say, yep, I've got 30 days of retention or not. And it's much easier to manage. Now, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and the complexity in getting to a centralized on-premise solution is really the bandwidth costs or fees. Either it's a internal network you own that connects all the sites together. For example, we've seen some school systems that have fiber links between each site in the school district. Well, that's great if you own that network and you have enough bandwidth and pipe. Awesome. But of course, you have to have that infrastructure, so you've paid for it in some form or fashion, or you're having to use the internet to aggregate some of this. Next is the cloud. And the cloud makes remote access even easier. It can make compliance pretty easy as well, but there's some, and the cost of storage in the cloud is pretty low. But it can be hard to integrate because if there are a lot of things in systems on-premise, for example, access controls on-premise and whatnot, it can take a little bit more work to pull off those integrations. But there's some things to really watch out for when thinking about actually storing the bulk of the video data in the cloud. And that's the bandwidth required to get the video up into the cloud. It has to do with privacy and data sovereignty issues, so GDPR or PII for HIPAA compliance. Do you own the data? Is it being sanitized in the right ways, or does it need to be sanitized in order to be stored in the cloud? These are some real pressing concerns. And if the data is in the cloud, it can also make it more challenging sometimes for you to have access to process it. Our recommendation here, and hopefully the formatting's not too messed up here, is that we don't recommend storing the data on the device. But we recommend having kind of a hybrid option that really takes into account the geographic distribution, the use case, the existing infrastructure that the customer has to determine how much of it is on a server on site, how much of it is centralized on premise, and how much of it gets pushed up to the cloud. There's no real right or wrong answer, but it is really important to factor in bandwidth costs, the access pattern, and how and where the data is actually going to get processed, because this is just storage. We haven't talked about the processing that needs to happen. A really quick example from an access pattern: if you're storing data up in the cloud and someone needs to use that data very frequently for investigation and forensic and for law enforcement, cloud can be a pretty poor option because you're having to pull that data many, many times. And so you're going to end up paying a lot in egress fees. But if you're using cloud just to make good on a retention policy and you're pushing it up to the cloud, but you're not accessing it often or regularly, it can be a lot more cost effective because the cost of storage in the cloud is pretty low. And if there are smart ways to manage some of the bandwidth, it can work out. So again, really pay attention to that. Next, we get into the actual data processing challenge, because it's one thing to have video data. It's another thing to actually process it to gain all of these insights that you can use to improve customer experience and business operation in either the top or bottom line of your business. And typically, at some point, you're going to have to do some transcoding. Transcoding is an essential part of being able to provide video to especially web and mobile clients, but even often workstations or other devices. It's certainly an important part of exporting out some of this video. And so one place to do some of this analysis, not necessarily the transcoding, but some of the analysis, is on the device itself. And that's a great option. It's super real time. You've already paid for the camera, right? The device is typically a camera. You've already paid for the camera, so you might as well use it. The compute cost is free. You own the camera. There's some issues with configuration and normalization. So again, it can be a challenge to remember the IP address and login of every single camera to go tweak and tune some of these analytic settings. The support can be hit or miss, whether the VMS can ingest it or other systems can ingest it, the data formats. But the device is a great option. The device is a really poor option for storing video data, but it's a great option for processing video data. You can use a server on site. Amazing for especially real-time use cases. Really great to do a lot of integrations with. The configuration and normalization challenges are a lot easier. You can start to do a little bit of aggregate analysis, but only to the cameras at any given site. So that's kind of a yellow. The compute cost starts to creep up because now you're investing in beefier kind of server equipment on site that can do this type of heavy lifting, typically with GPUs or other type of co-processors that are specialized to work on video data. The biggest challenge really comes down to it's a complex footprint. It can be hard to manage and kind of having these kind of individual sites doing this type of video processing. You have to be prepared for managing that complexity. So again, you can then go to centralized on-premise. The bandwidth cost is going to be an issue. The other really big issue with doing a lot of this transcoding and analytics in a centralized location is the real-timeness of it. Because necessarily that video is going to have to make a trip from wherever that location is to some centralized location where it then gets processed and the results get sent back. So there could be a challenge in addressing some use cases. And then last is the cloud. And the cloud, honestly, starts to get really tricky because real-time use cases can be incredibly challenging, if not impossible. There's still bandwidth costs and fees. And while storage in the cloud is super cheap and cost effective, processing in the cloud is very expensive, and often video processing tasks require either a lot of compute or fairly specialized compute, things like GPUs and whatnot. And so that can be even more expensive in the cloud if you're not careful. Our recommendation with this is definitely use the device as much as you can, because that's effectively free. You already have the camera. And be very careful about the cloud. The cloud isn't a bad option, but you can't use it as the end-all be-all for doing a lot of transcoding and data analytics, because it can start to get very expensive very quickly. So again, the geographic distribution, the use case, and the customer infrastructure will be really key factors. And you have to keep in mind access patterns, bandwidth costs, and also where the data is being stored. So, the answer to where you store the data goes hand in hand with where you're going to process it. So with that, kind of to bring this to a close, I know we're kind of getting close to time, is kind of this set of takeaways. We said there's some key questions that as you're working with clients, you want to engage them on in order to kind of go beyond just traditional video surveillance and safety and be able to do some of these more advanced use cases. And so one of those is this notion that, the video is one of the most important data assets. And the VMS, the video management software, is the data platform. And, thinking about video data as just kind of underutilized, untapped big data, and the VMS is a data platform that can allow, especially your customers, to generate unique business insights is the mindset. And so for the data collection side of it, I know we talked just about collecting data from the camera's angle, but really look for open platforms that have a variety of interfaces for pulling in data and that have easy kind of REST interfaces or whatever else to ingest the data. From a storage and processing and access perspective, look for platforms that give you control over the data and transparency. You can store your video data in someone's cloud, but if you don't have your hands on it, if you don't really own it, that can cause a lot of governance and compliance issues, but that can also make it impossible or very challenging to actually process that data to get deep insights. And so understand clearly the process for getting access to that data, to process it, and where that processing would take place and how it would play out. And the last part is, you've done all this processing, you've mixed and matched video data with other important data points across the business. How does that actually end up being used by your customer? You have to think about that too. So aim for extensible open interfaces. Think about trying to create unified experiences, because it can be very challenging to sell your customer on 6 different UIs for the 6 different things they want to do. So try and avoid totally separate UIs for every single analysis or use case, and look for unification of the platform. That kind of brings us to a close on, how you can think about and frame these conversations as you're selling video surveillance and VMS. Here at Salient, we've got a lot of experience doing it with a number of our clients. In fact, we've also, this is the one Salient plug I'll have, because a lot of what I've shared with you is completely agnostic and applies to really any camera manufacturer, any VMS platform out there. We're experienced in this, but we've also got a channel partner program, and we can absolutely partner up with, with you guys as you go to market, help in co-marketing, help in positioning, and help you, navigate some of these conversations with end user customers. So that's everything I've got. We're gonna, open it up for some questions now.
Thank you, Sanjay. Great stuff. So exciting with the possibilities and opportunities that are out there. Let's go through some of the questions that came in. First off, we have, what are some of the biggest security issues with video surveillance, and what do you do to protect your clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. Gosh, some of it depends on the deployment model. And this has been actively evolving. It used to be that video surveillance solutions were totally air-gapped on networks of their own, very closed off to the world. And so there was kind of a tolerance in that type of a deployment model to maybe get away with lax security on some components. But that world is changing a lot, increasingly, and I think the pandemic has actually accelerated a lot of this. The desire for remote access, being able to keep tabs on your retail location or your, the hospital system or the bank, from somewhere far, far away. And so I would say some of the security issues really have a lot to do with ensuring that the data in transit is properly encrypted, so TLS and certificate management. It has a lot to do with increasingly some of the metadata that's being produced. And so this metadata is much more likely to contain sensitive kind of PII data that regulators care about, whether it's for GDPR purposes, whether it's for HIPAA. And so, I would say some of the big privacy and security issues really have a lot to do with how open or how connected the video surveillance solution is. Some of the things that we do at Salient, and I think a lot of VMSs are starting to take this more seriously and look at this. It was kind of embarrassing, really, to see the big kind of issue that Verkada had and how sloppy they were handling master passwords, and kind of that became an attack point to expose access to a lot of the video that their clients had. But it's ensuring really good cyber best practices, investing in security, in each of the components and the links between them. We talked about there are two forms of communication: the management and configuration data, and then the video data. And thinking about both those streams and securing the data at rest and the data in transit, and also thinking about the access and permissioning models and having kind of the notion of least privilege. So there's a whole topic of its own on, securely, I'll say, operating video surveillance systems. But a lot of it comes down to best practices that have been well established in enterprise IT, and bringing those same practices to bear on video surveillance systems as they get more and more connected up.
Thank you. I want to remind our audience there's still a few minutes left to submit some questions. Some of the other ones we have on the queue here. When can I use the cloud for processing video data?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things we said in the presentation is the processing cost in the cloud can be very, very expensive. So it can be a dangerous route to take if you're going to do lots of and heavy amounts of processing in the cloud. Typically, what we see, what works best, is to first off, focus on less real-time use cases in the cloud. Second, typically we see the most kind of successful deployment patterns involve some type of pre-processing that's already happening on premise. And again, one of the things we said is, for a lot of these things, it's kind of a hybrid model. You don't do all of it or none of it in one place or the other. And so the idea being, there's some processing that maybe the camera or the device itself is doing. Maybe there's some pre-processing that's happening on an appliance or on a server on premise. And there is either just, a little bit of meta processing of the metadata or some post-processing that's happening up in the cloud. The cloud is especially useful for a lot of aggregated type of analytics. So doing things like counts, the reporting type of capabilities that are operating on metadata that's maybe already been generated or collected on premise. It's great for stuff like that, where it's less about specialized, transcoding or video processing type of work, and it's more general purpose compute that can be more, kind of forensic or investigative in nature as opposed to real time. And so these are some of the, I'll say, the best patterns for analytics in the cloud.
Thank you. Next one, why is the camera a bad place to store video data?
Yeah, we touched on this a bit, and it kind of flies in the face of some of the, I'll say, more, popular or in vogue conversations people are having today about, VSaaS and, camera direct to cloud and using the camera to store some of the data. Fundamentally, it's this fact that you leave the system very, very exposed. Someone can quite literally take a ladder, rip a camera off a wall, and there goes your data. It's typically not encrypted. And so there's quite a bit of risk there. And there's also the duty cycle of it. And when I say duty cycle, it's one thing to say, hey, I'm going to replace, the storage once every 3 to 5 years if it's centralized. That's pretty easy to do. You can access a closet and replace hard drives. It's a whole different thing to get a ladder and deal with an SD card or an SSD that's kind of been burned out with consistent wear and tear with all these read-write cycles on the device, on the camera. So there's some security concerns. There's some maintenance and reliability and kind of, how robust and how long-term a solution is this type of concerns. And so typically we just, the camera is great for processing video, but man, when it comes to actually storing the video, there are much better places to do it that are easier to service, that are easier to maintain, that extends the lifespan of the camera or the sensor, that leave you less exposed overall.
And Sanjay, this one is, if I'm using a single manufacturer's cameras, why should I go with ONVIF?
Yeah, the ONVIF versus native camera driver debate, it's a very kind of legit and an intense debate. I think one of the things I said in kind of going through that is, look, a lot of it has to do with the customer profile. The folks that have an appetite in the marketplace for gaining, valuable insights from video data, driving either top line or bottom line, customer experience, business operations, whatever else it is, typically tend to be customers that are larger, more mature, kind of enterprise grade or style customers. And what ends up happening is, even if they started out with a single camera manufacturer, through M&A activity, through kind of a variety of other reasons, even for a given camera manufacturer, between different camera lines or models, there can be some differences in some of the metadata that's produced. And so we look at it more from ONVIF is preferable for some of these larger deployments because it's just easier to scale. And half the challenge in getting more insight out of the video is doing it in a way that can scale across the deployment and not just solve it, for one camera at one site. Now, it's not to say that you should never use the native driver to solve some of this. And there might be some very kind of key markets where the deployments only get to a certain size. It's very easy to control for a given manufacturer or even in a specific model line of a camera, where all of it can be done with native camera drivers. But that's usually not the norm. And very typically there are these data normalization and scalability concerns, and we find that ONVIF typically is a better route to go. So I'd say that's one of the recommendation that is much more swayed by the market vertical, the use case, and the deployment pattern than some of the other recommendations that we have.
We have time for one or two more. Continuing on, what are the privacy data sovereignty concerns with cloud video data storage?
Yeah, this is very related to kind of the question that came up on, really big security issues with video surveillance. They kind of go hand in hand. I mean, what we see is, especially as these video surveillance systems are getting more connected, the biggest ones, this really comes up predominantly when we start talking about cloud. And there are regulations. Many of them are kind of geographically specific. So GDPR is a great example. But as video is becoming, I'll say, more intelligent and less dumb, there's actual metadata that kind of describes a bit more what's going on in the video, as video is getting associated with other databases, whether that's pictures of people's faces, whether that's other PII like the actual location information, names, whatever else, license plate numbers. The real concern is, there's regulation that kind of governs how this data needs to be handled. And I think that's something that maybe not enough people are thinking about. There's a real liability in failing to meet some of these data privacy and data security regulations, especially if you're storing the data in a location that you don't really own. You're effectively leasing storage if you're storing in someone's cloud. unless, of course, it's your own data center and it's your own private cloud. But that typically is not the typical deployment pattern. So when we talk about data sovereignty, when we talk about data privacy, a lot of it also depends on the vertical. If you've got video cameras deployed in a hospital system, some of the stuff that they have access to, some of the other data that gets associated with it, it can be pretty sensitive. And being careful about whether you're masking it, are you encrypting it or not, what type of rights and privileges do you have, where is that data being replicated to, if you're just kind of using some more generic cloud storage that you don't fully control. So it's really taking the time to more fully think about and answer some of these questions before saying, hey, storage in the cloud is super cheap, let me just go store some video up there, because there's some real ramifications to these decisions.
Thank you. We got time, a couple of minutes for this last one here. Once I start collecting metadata or doing analytics, how does this get presented to the user? What is the user interface like?
Wow, yeah. In this presentation, we didn't really spend a lot of time on, in many ways, one could argue, probably the most important part of it, which is, unlocking these insights has so much to do with the workflow and the operations. So, even the stories that we shared, for example, the logistics and transportation company that, is looking at the density of the object that they're about to ship and comparing that with the shipping rate to determine, hey, is there an anomaly? Has this, is this misclassified? Well, that entire use case just wouldn't work if, all this analysis was done, but it wasn't being presented up the right way, right? So kind of getting the right alert and notification and someone knowing that, hey, this is the box I got to open up and look at, and here's maybe what I'm trying to assess about it. And so we can't take that for granted. And we didn't get to touch on that a lot in here, in part because it's very nuanced. Some of the questions that, for example, a store operations person is trying to answer in retail are very different than, the types of questions that, this transportation and logistics person is trying to answer about, the goods that they're shipping. And so I think when it comes to the user interface, the simplest way to put it is the way that we've typically seen these use cases get adopted is by having kind of a unified, kind of product experience where it can be easily customized or enhanced or tailored to some of the different types of users that need to leverage the system. And, there's no right or wrong answer here either, but what we've seen is it's less successful when there's completely separate tools and UIs that people have to learn. And even if it's something like a tabbed interface where, hey, for a given type of analytic or for a different type of user, here is a tab or here's a part of the product experience. So it's still a single, for lack of a better word, pane of glass, or still a unified experience, whether that's a VMS or some other solution. But you've kind of got a way to serve the needs of different users without having to kind of relearn everything from the ground up, without having multiple systems to manage. That's really where the stuff starts to fall over, is having multiple independent, separate systems to manage and maintain, having to teach different types of users completely different products. That doesn't scale. And especially as an integrator out there trying to do this stuff, gosh, that just starts to become even more of a burden, because now you need to be an expert in umpteen different tools. That doesn't work. And so really thinking about, hey, are there product experiences that kind of package all this up? And maybe there are different modules, maybe there are different tabs that allow me to meet some of these kind of common use cases and needs, but do that with a single product or a single platform that's easier to manage and train and maintain.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sanjay. Thank you for being so thorough. And thank you to Salient for presenting today's webcast. Thank you, Sanjay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And thank you to our viewers. And I want to remind you that these webcasts are archived at securitysales.com. Look out for future webcasts, and also be sure to fill out the survey about today's webcast. Thank you again, and make it a safe day.